Well, it's Saturday night at 8 o'clock, and this is Joe Firestone for Real Progressives. But tonight we have what should be a fantastic show for you. Fadhel Kaboub is going to be joining us, I should say. He's the president of the Benzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and he is administering a very exciting research program on sustainable prosperity, particularly in the developing nations. He's got some great ideas, and you heard some of those ideas a week ago. For this broadcast, however, we're going to focus on a little bit of a review of what he did last week. And then we're going to move into a strategy for developing countries that are caught in the neoliberal trap to get out of that particular trap. So now I'm going to bring Fadhel in, and I'm not even sure I'm showing on the screen, so I will show myself on the screen, and I will bring Fadhel into the broadcast.
Okay. Am I on the screen?
As far as I know, you are on the screen. Are we all on the screen? Okay. And I'm going to get rid of the promo now. So here we are. There are already 20 people, okay, who are in our audience in the first couple of minutes. So that is very promising.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you for having me on the show. We wanted to start with a quick overview of what is the trap, the neoliberal trap that we discussed last week, and then spend the rest of the hour focusing on practical solutions that developing countries can implement right away. So I'll start with a quick recap. So the gist of the matter is that countries that don't have financial sovereignty, full financial sovereignty, are typically countries that end up borrowing externally, borrowing and promising to pay back in a foreign currency, typically dollars or euros or Japanese yen or British pounds or something like that. So I used the case of Tunisia last week to illustrate, so I'll probably continue with that particular example. But you can think of many developing countries who, because they have a trade deficit, they end up having to face the following options. They can either do nothing about it, and as a result, allow their currency to devalue relative to the dollar and the euro and other foreign currencies, or they can intervene and do something about it. So let's talk about what happens if you don't do anything. If the trade deficit just happens, the currency devalues. Well, what's going to happen the next morning is that anything that country is going to be buying from abroad, importing, it's going to be way more expensive in real terms because the national currency has devalued. So if you're buying food as a basic necessity, you're importing food inflation. If you're buying fuel for transportation or energy production, you're importing inflation as well. If you're buying medicine or intermediate goods for manufacturing or capital equipment or medicine, anything you're buying, you're essentially importing inflation, and you're just asking for social unrest for an uprising just because inflation is going to take over the system. So typically what some countries immediately do when they have a situation like this, they try to subsidize the basic necessities to sort of tame the effect of that imported inflation. So they subsidize food, basic food items, they subsidize transportation, they subsidize energy, anything that's driven by that imported inflation, they try to tame it a little bit for social reasons, for political reasons. So in order to do that, you have to be able to find a way to cover that trade deficit and artificially lift up the value of the exchange rate. And typically the way you do it is by borrowing foreign currencies. Because in the first place, the only way to get rid of that is to become a net exporter and not have to worry about the deficit in the first place. But developing countries, they tend to have those structural deficiencies. They tend to be energy deficient, so they have to import energy. They tend to be food production deficient, so they have to import food as a basic necessity. But they also tend to be not competitive when it comes to industries. So they import high value added content and they export low value added content. So no matter how much you export, you're always in that negative balance trap. And this is where international financial institutions come in, because as developing countries accumulate a large debt, external debt, the lenders get a little bit nervous when the debt gets to substantially high levels that are substantially higher than what the country can afford, given its import revenues, given its export revenues, I should say. So this is where the intervention of the IMF, for example, as a lender of last resort, comes in, and it's a conditional intervention. So the IMF loans are always subject to a certain number of rules. What we've seen recently with the conditional loans from the IMF to Greece, for example, to Tunisia more recently, to Egypt, all of these loans are conditional upon changing the way the government spends and tax and subsidizes the economy. So in the case of Tunisia, the loan was approved, but it's subject to a certain number of installments. So the loan is not given all at once. It's given in a number of installments, and each one of the installments is conditional upon changing the tax code or changing the foreign investment laws, or essentially reshaping the economy to fit the economic model that the IMF believes in. And the economic model that the IMF believes in is a neoliberal, neoclassical economic model that believes in free trade, that believes in free markets, and that believes in a minimal role for government intervention in society and in the economy. So it's about, eliminating all the barriers to free trade, eliminating all the barriers for entrepreneurship and business, and allowing the private sector to thrive. That's kind of a broad description.
Okay, so not to put but too fine a point on it, in return for the loans, the countries are giving up a very large measure of their sovereignty, okay, or their freedom to pursue the policies that they may think they need,
right,
in favor of the conditions that the lending institutions are imposing on them. Okay, and those conditions are actually very long term, aren't they?
Absolutely. So one of the conditions is central bank independence. Is essentially rewriting the terms of operations for the central bank and the treasury, and having the parliament vote for it, and essentially holding the country hostage economically. The loan will not be dispersed unless the parliament votes in a particular direction. And once you change the constitution, once you change these legal operational documents, it's very difficult to undo that. When you pass an investment code, the investment code in Tunisia is designed essentially to attract foreign direct investment. And you set up the taxing rules and the environmental pollution rules and the subsidies and wages and benefits for workers and labor laws related to foreign direct investment. This is essentially like creating a country within the country with a completely different legal code that applies only to foreign direct investment. Then you're really not able to undo that. And the idea is precisely not to be able to undo it, because the foreign direct investors want some level of certainty about relocating to a particular country. They want all of those advantages to be locked in. They don't want to move in and then have to move out, right? Or they don't want to move in and then realize that they're being taxed more after a couple of years. So these are long-term effects. And the tragedy of this is that developing countries find themselves backed up in a corner precisely because of this external debt, precisely because of the weaknesses in their industrial system. So politicians start looking for short-term solutions, very short-term solutions. So when you think of foreign direct investment, it's a foreign company coming in and they're gonna build a factory and they're gonna hire 500 people, low paid jobs typically. Well, in the middle of a crisis, 500 jobs is better than nothing, right?
You bet.
But the long-term effect of this is that you're subsidizing this particular factory in terms of electricity, in terms of water, in terms of wages, in terms of retirement benefits and health benefits. All of this is subsidized by the government just to attract that particular company. And then all the output that's being produced is going to be shipped abroad and consumed in the US or in Europe or in Japan or somewhere else. So the only direct effect, direct benefit that you get for the country is those 500 individuals who have an income and they can feed their families and they can, go on with their lives. But at the macro level, structurally, you're really losing, the net effect when you take into account how much is subsidized in electricity and food subsidies and retirement subsidies. It's a losing deal. And at the macro level, structurally, you're still an assembly line for the global economy. Yes. You're not at the top of the pyramid in terms of industrialization. You're at the bottom of the pyramid. All the high value added content is imported, and your workers are simply doing the assembly line job with very low value added content. So it looks like you're hiring 500 people. It looks like you're exporting, these finished goods, but structurally it's a losing game. So these are the long-term effects of these conditionalities. And the IMF conditionalities that we're seeing implemented in Greece and Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco. Morocco is also next on the line now in terms of their structural reforms. This is structural reforms 2.0 because the first structural reforms came, as I said last time, in the early 90s after the debt crisis of the 1980s. So this is now we're taking this to the next level. And the consequences, as I said, will be much more severe than what we've seen back in the late 80s and 90s. And I think this is the resistance that we're seeing in Tunisia, the youth movement that we're seeing in Tunisia resisting these economic policies actually gets it. It's the politicians who are not getting it. It's the mainstream media who's not getting it or trying to cover for it. And trying to tell everybody that, hey, this is just, there's no choice, there's no alternative. This is just the reality. You guys are too young, don't understand, what's going on. But I'm watching and I'm reading and I'm listening to the young people who are driving these protests. They get it. They get it that this is unsustainable, untenable as far as the young generation is concerned. Yet the politicians and the mainstream media are focusing on these protests as if it's a national security issue, that there's, some vandalism and there's some theft and there's some external forces trying to, divide the country. That may be true in some cases, but fundamentally the people who started the movement, who were leading the economic policy message against austerity, they get what's going on, and they need to be heard. But unfortunately, what we're seeing, even in the international media, is less of those voices and more of the voices that are calling for more serious security crackdown, more peace and more stability, and kind of get over it and understand this is the way things are done. This actually it's interesting. One of the young activists and public policy advocates in Tunisia, progressive public policy advocates, wrote an op-ed in The Guardian a few days ago. An excellent piece. I'll be happy to share it. I shared it, I think, on my Twitter feed. And 2 days later, it got the IMF press person and the IMF director in charge of the Middle East region to respond to that particular piece in a very condescending way, essentially saying, you guys are too young, don't understand, how the real things work. What we need is economic growth. And let me show you how economic growth works. And essentially started listing all the neoliberal IMF things, but did it as a direct response to that op-ed, and in a very condescending way, saying you guys have no idea. We want peace and we want prosperity for Tunisia, but there's only one way to do it, and this is the way to do it. So that's
Tina. There is no alternative to neoliberalism all over the world. Yeah, they do it in Greece, and they do it here too, really, state by state, okay, and city by city.
Yeah, you see the race to the bottom here. You see it from one state to the other. If you raise your minimum wage, everybody's going to cross the state line, and all the jobs will be lost. And companies do this. I mean, look at what Amazon is doing. They're shopping for a second headquarter, and they're getting cities to offer them all kinds of perks.
One of the cities involved, is Ashburn, Virginia, which is where I live.
Right.
Okay,
yeah,
and
corporations all the time.
I hope they do not.
And for that matter, sports teams in the U.S. do that too. They say, build us a new multi-billion-dollar stadium, otherwise we'll move, right? And leave you without a functioning economy, essentially. So that has to end. You can't have corporations hold states and municipalities hostage. If you don't give us a tax break, we're going to move next door. And states and municipalities need to recognize this. They need to organize, not individually, us against them, but organize collectively, saying we can't be treated like that. We can't have these corporations threaten our communities all the time and threaten to pack up and leave. So this is a global phenomenon, but it's, as you said, it's happening in every community. And it's a race to the bottom. It's an endless race to the bottom. And it's unsustainable environmentally, socially, economically. It's unsustainable.
Okay, so let's move to the strategy to defeat it.
Right.
Okay, I think that is really of enormous interest to everyone.
So the strategies, I hate to say that there's a cookie cutter approach to this. That's not the way I approach this. So it really has to be country specific, region specific. So I'll try to draw on the broadest commonalities, and then I'll try to discuss a little bit of the specifics that we need to pay attention to. So in terms of the non-oil exporting countries in the Middle East, for example, which most developing countries are not OPEC members, most developing countries are not oil exporting countries. The biggest, one of the biggest components of the external debt, one of the biggest component of their trade deficit is energy imports. And to put it simply, in this day and age, with the kind of technological advances that we have, it doesn't make any sense for any country to keep delaying the implementation of green renewable energy technologies and to keep subsidizing fossil fuel and public transportation of imported oil and imported oil and gas for producing electricity. So we're not saying flip the whole country overnight to 100% renewable energy electricity production, but that should be the goal. And what we can do is gradually shift from whatever we're subsidizing to producing domestic, renewable, sustainable energy production. So in the case of Tunisia, solar is a no-brainer. Wind is a no-brainer. Geothermal is also a no-brainer. And here, when you think of these industries, these are job creators, and these are long-term job creation sectors that create jobs, not just in terms of the construction and the putting together of the resources, but it's also high-end, high skills that can be used for research and development, engineering and manufacturing. There's no reason that this would be sort of, let's import solar panels and let's have a German company install it for us. So this is the future. So you have to start building the skills, educational, vocational training skills, engineering skills domestically, so that this can become self-sustaining. And one of the main problems that people usually highlight when it comes to renewable energy, especially solar and wind and tidal energy, is the question of what happens when it's a cloudy day, or what happens when it's not windy, or what happens when the waves slow down, and this happens at a moment when you need that excess energy production for the peak consumption hours of the day. So storage becomes a huge issue. And there's a lot of new technologies in this area, Tesla being one of them, for traditional battery storage. Making it more efficient, making it cheaper and more accessible is the ultimate goal. but it's not the only solution for energy storage. There are sort of relatively more accessible, low-tech methods of storage using hydroelectric storage. So if you as a country set a goal to produce as much as possible of renewable energy infrastructure, solar and wind, and then use the production during the day, typically for solar during the day. If you're producing a surplus of solar during the day, one of the best ways to store it is to use the electricity produced during the day, during the peak hours of production, to pump water, say from a lower level reservoir to a higher altitude reservoir. And we're not talking about, hundreds of kilometers. We're talking about 300, 400 meters higher level. So you're pumping water to a higher level reservoir during the peak production of electricity, solar electricity. And then when the moment comes later during the night, when people go home and when there's much more consumption of electricity and you need that additional production of electricity, you release the water from the upper level reservoir and gravity does the job. So as you're releasing the water, it's like you have a waterfall, and then you produce electricity by the flow of water from the higher level reservoir to the lower level reservoir. And of course, the larger the reservoir, the larger the quantity of water, the larger the amount of electricity you can store. Technically, you're storing energy with that method. So that's a simple technology, but it's not obviously straightforward. It's not easy to build and monitor and manage. But when this is what I said, this is the room for engineering and technical skills, higher levels of skills to enter this industry domestically. And I'm talking about a country like Tunisia that has hundreds of unemployed engineers, hundreds of unemployed people with chemistry degrees and biology degrees and all kinds of degrees. And that's why you see the obsession of the government. We need to bring these foreign direct investment companies to hire these highly skilled people. And it's this vicious cycle of this obsession with export-led growth, this obsession with foreign direct investment, that we need to find practical solutions that serve the country in the long term, create jobs immediately, and then start this virtuous cycle of research and development using local resources, physical resources, local know-how, and local educational infrastructure to serve the economy, the local economy, as opposed to export to the rest of the world. So the priority should always be local production, local consumption, local prosperity. And if there's a surplus, then that should go to exports. And that should be the case for any country, because the priority should be serving the local economy. So this is one example. In terms of wind, it's the same thing. The storage technology can be used. The wind can be, there's new research and development, new innovations now for wind turbines, where traditionally wind turbines were limited to places that has a certain minimum level of wind activity. So that disqualified lots of other regions, lots of other cities. But now with the new technologies, there is much more efficient kinds of turbines, even vertical turbines, that can use very low levels of wind activity and produce the same, if not more, electricity than the traditional wind turbine. So there's lots of advances in this area. Then you have tidal energy for countries that have rivers, for countries that have access to seawater or coastal areas. Again, it's a no-brainer to use the tidal, the energy of the waves to produce electricity. Again, all of these technologies, the problem then is storage, then we have to find solutions for storage. But the point is, we're not even close to facing the storage crisis because we don't have enough production of renewable energy to worry about the storage. So in the intermediate time, keep the existing, fossil fuel electricity production units in place because they're still dominant anyway, but have a long-term goal of transitioning to 100% renewable and building as much storage capacity, renewable energy storage capacity as possible. And then if we reach a crisis moment, when we have 100% renewable electricity and we're done with fossil fuels and nuclear and all kinds of dirty energy production, then we can continue innovating using human ingenuity and research and development to figure out better storage solutions. And I'm confident that by then we'll have even more kinds of storage technologies in place. But if we keep subsidizing the dirty fossil fuel industry, then essentially we're discouraging all the research and innovation that's going in that direction. So I want to say a couple of words also about energy consumption in developing countries. There is a lot of room for reducing energy consumption. The simplest thing to do is to switch from the old-fashioned light bulbs and neon lights to LEDs. And I was in Tunisia a few months ago, and I was ages. We're talking about using a simple resource, domestic resource, applying brain power, research and development, and developing the most beautiful new designs, the most sophisticated, the most solid kinds of bricks that can be used for building housing, not just for high-income earners, but housing for everyone. One of my favorite phrases about in relation to poverty and housing is that it might be okay to be poor, but you don't necessarily have to live in poor conditions. And that's something that I invite and challenge all my friends and colleagues who are in this field, in architecture and design, to move away from traditional European type architecture and to look within and look back at the traditional architecture and design that has, some of it is still standing today in many parts of the world. And it's one of the most beautiful type of architecture, but it's also the most sustainable. So it doesn't require cooling during the winter, and it doesn't require, it doesn't require cooling during the summer. It doesn't require much heating during the winter time. With the added advances now in insulation for windows and doors, that would tremendously also improve the energy efficiency of housing today. I'll say one more word about geothermal technology, and this is now implemented across the world. The only difficulty with the kind of retrofitting existing homes with geothermal technology is that it's too expensive. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue it. And especially we should pursue it for every single new structure that's built, because that's the cheapest way to introduce it to a housing unit, to a building, is to build the geothermal infrastructure before you build the house or before you build the building, because it requires digging. As you're digging the foundations, you might as well install the geothermal technology right there. And to describe it very briefly, you're essentially consuming extremely low levels of electricity. It's essentially a fan, and fans don't consume a lot of electricity. So you can run it on a very small solar panel, and it's off the grid, self-sustaining ventilation system for heating and cooling. And essentially, it's a series of pipes in a closed loop circle that takes air from inside the building and pumps it several feet down below the building, below the top of the soil, below the earth, inside the earth, I should say, because the temperature of the earth will eventually stabilize. So during the winter time, as you dig deeper in the soil, it gets warmer and warmer. That's why all the insects go hiding underground. That's why all the animals go hibernating underground, because it's much warmer than the surface. So you get to a certain level of warmth where if you start pumping the air, the cold air from inside the building down to that level, it will bring you back, because it's in a closed loop circle, it will bring you back warmer air from the bottom of that closed loop circle. So your fan is simply circulating air from the building down the pipes, and then it gets warmed up and then brought back into the building. And you can control it, you can install filters on it, you can do all kinds of more sophisticated things. And in the summertime, it's the same thing. The surface of the earth is much hotter than lower levels of below the surface of the earth. So now your air circulation is taking warmer air from inside the building, pumping it several feet down the pipes to cool down and bring you much fresher air into the building. And that could be climate controlled and so on. So this is, it wasn't invented yesterday. It wasn't invented in the 70s by hippies, but this is the essence of geothermal technology. And there's plenty of room for essentially moving away from air conditioning altogether, and moving away from traditional heating for countries that have cold climate. So my dream is to have a law in place that says we're not going to accept or we're not going to allow any new building to be put in place, any new apartment complex to be put in place without the installation of geothermal technology, because that's the cheapest moment to build it, is when you're building the foundations for the building. Joe, do you have any questions coming through about this particular part? Because next I want to move to solutions related to agricultural sustainability. I'm not sure if Joe is online right now. May have lost him. So maybe if somebody can comment and let me know. if I should continue or if I'm offline. Hello? Oh, people are saying I should continue. Okay, so maybe Joe is having some technical difficulties. So I'll move on and talk a little bit about I'll talk about agriculture. So when we go back to the external debt problem that I talked about a little bit ago, one of the biggest components is imports of energy. And the second major component is imports of food for production, for food consumption. So here, again, the ultimate solution to that problem is producing food domestically, essentially regaining self-sufficiency for food consumption. And there's plenty of room for the use of sustainable organic production technologies. And essentially, this is what I'm proposing is not new. What I'm proposing is going back to traditional ways of doing organic agriculture that has been undone, destroyed either through colonial or post-colonial economic policies. And one of the things that the World Bank, for example, did in the 70s and 80s, encouraging developing countries to accelerate food production and food exports at the time, is to go to larger scale farming as opposed to smaller units, kind of larger agribusiness, and to go to use modern day agricultural technology, which includes, large scale agriculture with heavy duty equipment, tractors and so on, but also use imported fertilizers. And in more recent years, with the rise of Monsanto and other such companies, with the use of genetically modified crops, which has been a trap for a lot of farmers in developing countries. There's lots of case studies about this in India in particular, where you use a bag of seeds to grow for one season, and then you realize that you can't use your land for anything else, and you're stuck, and you have to buy those seeds again and again every year from the same company at increasing prices. So that has been a trap for a lot of farmers in developing countries. So what I'm proposing here is going back to focusing on the production priorities, the consumption priorities within the country, and trying to reallocate land and resources, and water resources in the most effective way that serves the local economy. And here I want to open a little parenthesis about food consumption. So I'll talk about food production and food consumption at the same time, because we do have problems on the food consumption side as well, and food waste in particular. But let me start with food consumption. I think a little bit ago, Joe put a slide on the screen that shows an aquaponics design. I'm not sure if Joe is still able to manipulate the screen. If not, you can just Google aquaponics design, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So the simplest way to describe aquaponics technology is that you're growing fish in a fish tank. So freshwater fish, tilapia, for example, tends to be the most popular kind, but you can grow shrimp and you can grow all kinds of other things. So you're growing fish in a fish tank. And that fish tank requires a couple of things. You need to feed the fish, ideally organic feed. Oh, here it is. I think it's on the screen. So what you're seeing here is the fish tank is at the bottom of the screen, and you see pipes with arrows circulating water from the fish tank to the grow bed. And the grow bed is where you're growing leafy greens, lettuce and mint and all kinds of leafy greens. And some people grow tomatoes, some people grow all kinds of things. So let's say you're growing lettuce, right? Or mint or whatever. So now the water is being pumped from the fish tank all the way up to the grow bed. and then it's draining back down into the fish tank, essentially with gravity. There's no need to pump anything. So in terms of electricity consumption here, the only electricity you're consuming is the pump that's pumping the water up. And then there's typically an air pump that produces, adds oxygen to the fish tank to make the fish happy. And it's in this picture here, it's called Airstone, right, for the air pump. So very minimal energy consumption. The grow bed doesn't use any soil. What you see there is growing, it's called growing tray, but it's really clay pebbles. The advantage of clay pebbles is that they tend to hold moisture, and it allows the right kind of bacteria to be housed and to develop there. And the job of that bacteria is to break down the waste from the fish and transform it into nutrients that essentially become the only source of nutrition for the plants because there's no soil in there, right? Now, if you look at the picture carefully, the bacteria is developing throughout the system. It's not just the bacteria in the grow bed. There's also bacteria in the water with the fish. It's the same kind of bacteria. Its job is to break down the waste and transform it into nutrients. The nutrients go to the plants. The plants will absorb all the nutrients, and the plants will return the clean, fresh water to the fish. So this saves 95% of water consumption compared to traditional agriculture. So if you are growing that kind of lettuce in the traditional way in soil, it will consume 95% more water, right, than this. So of course there'll be some water evaporation, and the plants will consume some of the water. So every now and then you'll add a little bit water to the system, but it's the best water saving technology when it comes to agriculture. The other advantage of this, and the reason why this is 100% organic, is because you can't add any chemical fertilizers to the system. Anything you add to the system will disturb the balance, will kill the fish, will kill the plants. So it just kills the system. So it has to be, think of it as its own independent ecosystem. You can introduce all kinds of other things to it. Some people add particular nutrients. Some people will start testing different kinds of food for fish to produce different kinds of flavors. You need to worry about, the lighting. You need to worry about the air temperature, humidity. There's additional research that you can introduce to sophisticate your production system. And there's, believe it or not, there's, big R&D companies investing hundreds of millions of dollars of research and development into sophisticating this technology and turn it into sort of large-scale mass production units. The advantage of this is that you don't have to use your most fertile soil in the country to produce leafy greens or to produce fish. You can locate these units in areas that have been historically socioeconomically excluded from the rest of the economy. So I'm thinking of rural areas in some countries in the Middle East, like Tunisia, where there's no access to jobs, there's no access to fresh food, there's no access to healthy nutrition, there's no access to meat, right, or fish for that matter. So you can think of these as a stepping stone to larger research and development, larger units of production. You can think of this as a source of either additional nutrition for some families or a source of additional income if what they produce is for sale. And from what I've seen for the smaller scale units, sort of household size units, kind of a 200-gallon fish tank with the appropriate amount of grow beds that go with it, because the number of fish has to be proportional to the number of plants you're growing, because the fish is producing the nutrients, so you need to have enough nutrients for the system, for the plants to survive and thrive. Essentially, most estimates that I've seen put the cost of the system at between $1,000 and $2,000 for a unit that will produce way more than enough to feed an entire family and to produce for market for sale. So within 1 year of operating the system, it completely pays for itself. Less than 1 year, actually. And it becomes self-sustaining, especially if this is off the grid with a small solar panel. after a few months, the system pays for itself and continues to produce for that additional family or for the next community. My idea here is to introduce this on a relatively small scale, because you need to develop the skills necessary for managing the system, for replicating the system, for making sure that the system is healthy, because it's really about striking an interesting balance between the quality of life of the fish in terms of pH level and water temperature, even in some cases, and so a balance between the quality of life of the fish and the quality of life of the plants. And you can think of the neat thing about aquaponics technology, that it can be scaled up at an industrial level. So it doesn't have to be just a household unit type of system. It can be scaled up tremendously. And if we're successful at producing the right kinds of skills and know-how, and we're successful at introducing this new type of food, because it's really, there's usually a lot of resistance to new kinds of production, because people say, well, what if it doesn't taste the same? What if the plants taste weird? What if, but people have to test it for themselves and taste it for themselves. To be convinced that it's nutritious, if not more nutritious than other, and it's produced locally right next door to where it's being consumed. So it's, by definition, it's much more fresh of a product than something that's been stored and refrigerated and driven, hundreds of miles away to be delivered to your local market. So there's that freshness advantage. There's the organic nature of it that's guaranteed by design. And then there's the job creation and the community empowerment effect that this kind of production does. But if we're successful in introducing the skills, the know-how, and introducing this new item to the marketplace, then we can think of scaling this up at the national level. Then it becomes much more strategic, because now what you want to do is move all the leafy greens production and the strawberries production, for example. Strawberries consume a lot of water, to aquaponic systems that can be done in areas that don't have fertile soil and areas that don't have fresh water for traditional agriculture. So you create the jobs in those areas, and then use the most fertile land and the most precious water resources for producing things like wheat, which is a highly demanded crop in countries like Tunisia and Egypt and Morocco. It's actually, those countries are the largest importers of wheat in the world, Egypt being the number one. So this way, you're restructuring the entire agricultural system to increase the efficiency of water use, to improve the quality of what you're producing in terms of organic products, and to create jobs and to transform economies that have been left behind and completely isolated from the job creation cycle. And if you introduce this kind of job creation in communities that currently don't have any other alternatives for jobs, then you reduce the need for bringing foreign direct investment to those areas and using more extractive, resource intensive types of export industries into creating a new kind of dynamic within those regions. So this is one piece of the puzzle in terms of producing food locally, especially that have been forgotten by policymakers for a long time. Now, add to this piece a second piece that's related to sustainable architecture and design that I described earlier. So think of a local restaurant in a rural area that's selling, essentially producing all of its dishes using organic food produced locally from a local aquaponics system. And the restaurant itself, or the bed and breakfast itself, is built with traditional designs, with geothermal technology, using geothermal heating and cooling, and using all the know-how of the local community for building and design. That's an attractive thing in the tourism industry. Here we're thinking about ecotourism. So you're bringing higher quality of food high quality of bed and breakfast and restaurant, structure, design, and architecture. And the third piece you want to add to that is reviving the cultural heritage of different regions within the country, within the world, where the local community is now not only producing the food and producing the services in the community and creating jobs within the community, but now it's reviving its own cultural heritage. In many regions, languages have been lost, music and poetry has been lost, oral history of the region, because the elders are gone, and increasingly so with migration to larger cities. And the best way to capture the history and the culture and pride of those regions is to have a set of cultural oriented jobs, music and theater and storytelling and book writing and blogging, that's related to the local towns and communities. So you create a self-sustaining unit, economic unit, that can thrive on its own. It can attract a different kind of tourism. So not tourism of, traditional waste of water and kind of, I'm thinking here of Tunisian kind of tourism, which is subsidized hotels on the beach, very high energy consumption, water consumption, and food waste, with no connection to the cultural heritage of the country. It's kind of going to the beach and then going back to the airport and going back to Europe. So this is a different kind of tourism. It's a tourism that respects the local economy, the local culture, and it's a tourism that supports the local culture and the local community. So it's self-sustaining, it creates jobs, and it creates higher paying jobs, higher quality food, higher quality service. And you start to introduce a sense of hope within those communities, a sense of pride, and an energy for revival of and improvement of economic activity and quality of life. So think of this as a first step in this direction. The second part that I wanted to discuss in terms of food consumption and food waste, and this is true for many countries, not just in developing countries, but obviously the question becomes much more severe in developing countries because of the trade deficit and the external debt problems. If the external debt and the trade deficit, cost is going to subsidizing food and fuel, then you definitely don't want to waste more of that. But there's also another serious problem that I'll discuss in relation to the Middle East, Tunisia included, but Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, even the oil exporting countries suffer severely from this food problem. Food waste, number one, and I'll leave that aside, but number two, it's what kind of food you're consuming. So here we're talking about the Middle East as a region, Egypt being number one in the world in terms of imports of wheat for bread consumption. If you look at the traditional Middle Eastern diet in many of these countries, it's a lot of bread consumption for sandwiches. It's a lot of wheat consumption for pasta. And it's a lot of low levels of nutrition, carbs that are going into, essentially you're subsidizing the purchase of sugar, you're subsidizing wheat and flour, you're subsidizing all of these elements as you import them as a country. But then you look at the public health effect of consuming large, substantial and large quantities of sugar and wheat, and the kinds of diet that many people suffer from in the region, my family included. I mean, you can ask as many people as you know in the Middle East, and they'll tell you how many cousins and uncles and aunts they have suffering from diabetes and suffering from all kinds of diet-related health problems. So not only we subsidize the food as we buy it and as we consume it, but then we subsidize the public health cost of diabetes and heart disease and all kinds of health conditions and illnesses that have a real cost on society, and just the financial cost, but the real cost in terms of people, dying younger, people suffering loss of productivity, loss of economic activity at a much younger age than necessary. So this part is difficult because you can't, snap your finger and say, today we're going to switch, our diets as a nation. I mean, try doing that individually. And many people have tried. I tried it myself. It's not easy. But this has to be a long-term goal for introducing alternative kinds of diets, ideally more nutritious diets that are produced locally, domestically, but introducing this not just as a demand from the government. You have to eat this food that has to be introduced in a culturally appropriate way. In an educational way, so that younger people especially, are educated about the health effects of consuming too much sugar, of consuming too much wheat, of consuming less nutritious, food items, and at the same time, the benefits of consuming highly nutritious leafy greens, local foods, and invite the entire community of specialists in food and the food culture to use the most nutritious local crops and design and introduce the tastiest dishes that speak the most to the local culture. Design and introduce the tastiest new kinds of desserts and use their creativity to design a new kind of food culture that will be embraced by the local community, that will feed back into the prosperous food production system that we're introducing here, that's driven by local crops as opposed to imported crops. And this is not just for chefs to do this. We're talking about people who have PhDs in chemistry and nutrition and agriculture. This is a high-tech field, and this requires a lot of collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, long-term collaboration, and a strategy by these governments, because this is not going to happen by accident. If we don't do anything, then the status quo will continue pushing the system in the same direction. So here we're thinking of educational resources, media and PR resources, even entertainment resources, because food is part of the culture. Food is part of entertainment. So the entertainment and the media sector has to be involved in this, but also the scientists and the specialists in health and nutrition and the medical community, doctors and nurses and professional staff in hospitals. Everybody has to be on board with a long-term strategy of producing a different kind of public health system. And the benefits are not just economic benefits in terms of reducing the cost of imports and sustaining a stronger local economic system and agricultural system, but the quality of life improvements for everyone will be tremendous. The productivity improvement will be tremendous. And then obviously the public health, the efficiency of the public health system will be much more effective than what we currently have. There's one country that I noticed in the last literally 6 months launched a major campaign designed in this direction. It's the UAE that really recognized the negative effects of in terms of public health. They see this as a public health crisis. But they don't have all the components that I described here, but they're definitely started with the educational piece, starting with the younger kids and really pushing the message across all the generations. And this will pay off in a generation. In a generation or two, you'll start seeing changes, but it has to be supported by an ecosystem, like an economic ecosystem, not just kind of media campaign and telling people what to eat and what not to eat. You have to introduce it in a way that sort of becomes internal to the culture and embraced by the culture and developed by the culture itself, by people from within. So it can't be just a couple of bureaucrats in the Ministry of Health saying this is what needs to be done. This is a much more complicated issue to address. And then I don't know if Joe is still online or not. I think we're coming up to the hour, but I'll say a couple more words, and then maybe we'll either Joe comes back or we'll end the show here. The last component that I wanted to highlight that most developing countries suffer from is the value-added content deficiency. So you have developing countries that import a lot of high value-added content, advanced technology, intermediate goods that have been designed and assembled in high-tech countries, the software and all that. And then, your local workers are simply assembling the pieces and selling and producing the final output. It looks like a piece of high-tech equipment, like a cell phone, but it turns out that the workers that assemble the pieces have put very little in value added to it. And that's a general problem for developing countries. What you want to do is, get to a point where you're putting more value added in the production that you're involved in than what you're importing. This becomes a challenge because of technologies, advanced technologies and high value added technologies have been monopolized by developed countries, by the industrialized countries. So in many countries, there's essentially a ban on exporting the technology itself. You're more than welcome to buy it and use it, but you can't, become a producer of that technology for understandable reasons. But this means that developing countries don't really have to be stuck in this vicious cycle of having to continuously serve as the assembly line for the rest of the world. And especially the way we're looking at globalization, being engaged in an assembly line at the global level and then racing to the bottom because you're competing with your neighboring, developing countries saying, I'll do it cheaper and faster and you don't have to worry about pollution and we'll subsidize your electricity, we'll subsidize your water, we'll build the factory for you so that you attract more foreign direct investment than in the neighboring country. That's a vicious trap that developing countries are continuing to put themselves in. And unfortunately, over the decades, we've created institutional and legal frameworks to enforce this kind of behavior and reward this kind of behavior without realizing that it's actually not helping any of these developing countries. As I said in the beginning, you create 500 jobs because you created this assembly line, but on the larger scheme of things, you're really not helping your economy in the long run. So the only way to be able to move up the ladder, so to speak, from low value added content to higher value added content is to invest in research and development, to invest in education and vocational training, and to move to the level of innovation and design as opposed to just assembly line. And that takes time, and that takes a lot of investment in education and vocational training. But it has to be done. There's no other alternative. But once you move to that level, and if you're successful as a single country, you still have to realize that as a small country, you're not going to be able to break into the global market on your own. You need access to markets. And competition is an important component of industrialization. And this competition piece is really what one of the bigger pieces of the puzzle that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank try to promote free trade and industrialization and export-led growth because they say it involves competition and competition is good and it's healthy. And the metaphor that I like to use when it comes to competition is a sports metaphor. So in sports, we enjoy watching the competition. It's healthy, it's exciting, and it's fair under the rules of the game and everything. But we never allow, for example, a heavyweight boxing champion to play against a lightweight boxing champion. It's illegal. And nobody would watch it. Nobody would enjoy it, and we wouldn't allow it to happen in the first place. And yet, when it comes to industrial competition and free trade, in the context of globalization, we allow heavyweight industrialized countries to compete with lightweight, in developing countries, and we say it's fair, it's free trade, it's competition, it's healthy. Well, it's not. It's ugly. It's not. It should be illegal. It's not a just like a boxing game between a heavyweight and a lightweight champion. It's not pleasant to watch. Nobody would enjoy it. Well, I don't enjoy watching the global free trade system, because it's destructive in the same way that you watch a heavyweight boxing champion, essentially destroy a lightweight boxer in a ring. So competition is healthy and good, but it has to be amongst equals. So a heavyweight champion compete with heavyweight, lightweight champion compete with lightweight. That's what the Olympics is for. That's what sports is about. And that's what competition in the economic sense of the term should be about. So I'm for competition amongst equal when it comes to trade. So developing countries building smaller regional trading units so that you have access to a larger market, because you do need larger consumer base. But you have to find these regional units of developing countries that are ideally close by, build transportation infrastructure within those countries, because that's usually a big problem. Neighboring countries in the developing world lack massive amount of transportation across border. And then find those countries that have complementary sets of resources and introduce a larger consumer base, and then introduce competition within the larger unit. So this is what some economists refer to as South-South trade. So countries in the southern, metaphorically southern context of the world. So this way, you are enhancing competition, and competition will improve technology, will improve efficiency, will improve prices, will improve customer service. Yes, all of those things will happen under the right kind of circumstances. So there's a whole legal and institutional framework to be set up to encourage this kind of competition and this kind of growth in manufacturing. In addition to it, having to be done in the context of sustainability. And it shouldn't be done for the sake of promoting more consumerism, for promoting more energy consumption and waste. We have to be very strategic if we're designing these long-term South-South trade relations and trade competition. It shouldn't be for the sake of producing useless toys that destroy the environment and feed into the consumerist culture that we already suffer from. So we have to be very strategic. And every time we think about industrialization, it shouldn't be in the context of trying to catch up with the West, trying to catch up with whatever the US is doing, whatever Europe is doing. It has to be done strategically for the needs of those particular countries, for the needs of the particular regions. And if it's done just for the sake of growth, then that's the wrong industrial strategy. It has to be done for the sake of serving and improving quality of life in those communities. And with that, I think I'll stop here because I think we passed the hour. And if Joe is available to come in and close the session, I'll wait for Joe. And I'm told that Joe can see us. So we'll just close the session here. If you have any questions, because I'm not able to monitor all the questions live, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in even after we end the session. I'm not sure if I can close the session from here. I'll try. So feel free to type questions, and within the next few days, I'll go back to all the comments and try to answer them. And I'll try to tag you to make sure that you get the answers. So I hope this was useful. This is just a sketch of some of the possibilities. One of the reasons I'm doing these series of presentations, trying to introduce MMT in the context of developing countries, is really to open the door to all the possibilities and to let people know that, the old Margaret Thatcher statement that there is no alternative. This is really the core of the IMF and World Bank strategies. Is really, and I see Joe is back.
Okay, I am back.
Okay, so the old Margaret Thatcher statement that there is no alternative. My goal in doing this series of presentations about MMT in developing countries is to say that there is a real alternative. There is lots of possibilities as long as we have our strategies focused on the priorities, especially if you understand the concept of financial sovereignty and monetary sovereignty. And if we're committed to improving quality of life as a primary goal, not growth for the sake of growth, there's plenty of solutions. We need to partner with people from different backgrounds, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of communication and research and development. That's the only way out. When it comes to that, there's really no other alternative other than focusing on sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and focusing the manufacturing and industrial system to serve the needs of local economies and regional economies, as opposed to serving the global neoliberal system that we've been stuck in since the introduction of free trade rules of the GATT and then the WTO eventually.
A question. It seemed to me that you spoke only briefly about the energy solutions that are available to some of the nations.
Yep.
Okay, and it seemed to me that self-sufficiency, in energy, is extremely important to the developing nations. If I had to say what two things were most important, I would say it's food, followed by energy.
Right.
Okay. So what are the prospects for solar and for wind power in the developing nations?
I don't know if you lost audio at some point. I did talk about solar and wind and tidal energy a little bit. I don't know if you wanted more or if you just didn't hear that part.
Okay. It's possible that I did not hear that part. For a while, what I was trying to do was to get in over here, and I had the television on in the next room.
Okay.
Okay, and I was broadcasting to the television also, but I could not actually hear it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So I can what you said about it. Okay, and if you could say something in a little more detail, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. So the potential for wind and solar is tremendous, and I added also geothermal energy for heating and cooling housing units. There's also the large-scale geothermal that only a handful of countries can really leverage effectively. So Iceland, the whole island runs on volcanoes, essentially, energy from volcanoes. So that's possible in many parts of the world, large-scale electricity production using geothermal energy from volcanoes. But the geothermal I was talking about is very simple ventilation technology for heating and cooling homes and buildings. But also I talked a little bit about the architecture and design and use of material that's much more energy efficient. In terms of solar and wind, for developing countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and Asia, I mean, Germany has a substantial amount of solar energy production, and it's not the sunniest place on earth. So the potential is unbelievable. The sky is the limit, so to speak. But also recent advances in wind turbine design. The traditional large-scale wind turbines that required a minimum amount of wind flow to really be effective are now being challenged by smaller units that don't really require the altitude that the older generation of wind turbines required, and don't also require the minimum amount of wind flow to really operate. So even at low levels of wind breeze, they can still be as effective, as efficient, if not more efficient in some cases, depending on how you place them. So there's vertical wind turbines. I talked about them a little bit. So the technology is advancing tremendously. And really the sky is the limit, because once you build the initial infrastructure, it's providing free energy, minus the the maintenance cost.
Yeah, with respect to the smaller turbines, I take it they're also much cheaper to construct.
Much cheaper because much more efficient because you can put them closer to each other, so you can put more in a more limited space. So the cost is falling tremendously. It's just governments need to build the infrastructure, the grid, and switch subsidies away from fossil fuel subsidies to subsidizing the energy of the future, the jobs of the future. So there's lots of possibilities. Tidal energy for countries that have major rivers or have coastal sea areas. Tidal energy is extremely important. And I don't know if you were able to listen to the part where I talked about I think that's where I lost you, is when I was talking about using water reservoirs to store energy. So you're essentially pumping water from a low-level reservoir to a higher altitude reservoir, like 300 or 400 meters higher, during the hours of electricity production with solar, for example, and then releasing the water and producing electricity at night or during the peak consumption hours. The technology is pretty straightforward. It doesn't mean that I can build it tomorrow, but it means that with a minimal amount of engineering skills, any developing country can dedicate resources and brain power to build those kinds of hydraulic batteries, basically, storage units. And the more of those units you have, the more stability you have on the grid. The larger those reservoirs are, the more you can produce at the peak hours. So the sky's the limit in terms of the possibilities, and the solutions are developing much faster than the climate deniers can deny them at this point.
Okay, so to close, but can you summarize the strategy for developing nations to follow to get out of the trap? So,
number one, as I was saying a minute ago, the renewable energy is the future. The solutions are there. We need to push for committing governments to investing more and shifting subsidies away from fossil fuels into renewable energy, dedicating educational resources in terms of training and education to produce the skills for those industries, as opposed to producing the skills for the oil industry and fossil fuel industry, because you need to staff those industries, and you need to not just import the technology, but you need to become designer and producer and manager of the technology yourself internally, in the case of developing countries. So that's on the energy front. On the food front, start introducing more sustainable local food production, and then use that as a stepping stone to produce a new kind of ecosystem for ecotourism with sustainable housing and hotel and restaurant industry that goes with that self-sustaining ecosystem of food production and economic activity, especially in areas that have been excluded from economic prosperity, and invest quite a bit of resources in improving access to preserving cultural heritage, music and arts and culture and entertainment, so that you plug that into the food production system, you plug that into the ecotourism system, and you create these new self-sustaining units that can create their own jobs and attract their own economic activity without having to import food from hundreds of miles away and depend on foreign direct investment to create jobs, and have to depend less on the extractive mining industries that are simply extracting and polluting those regions. So that's on the food front. Number three is the last piece, is the manufacturing and trade system that I described towards the end of the session, which is extremely important to realize that trade, this mythology about free trade is good and competition is good. I use the metaphor, the sports metaphor, by saying, competition amongst equal is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. It's a pleasant thing to watch. But competition between a heavyweight champion and a lightweight boxing champion is ugly, it's destructive. Nobody wants to watch it. It's illegal. right, to begin with. And yet we allow it when it comes to free trade, when it comes to manufacturing and economic trade. That has to be recognized. That has to be changed. There's still benefits from competition amongst equal. So we have to create units within which you have a larger access to a consumer base, but within a system that's equally competitive. So regional trade units where developing countries can cooperate, can build infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, logistics infrastructure, but also compete for improving quality, for improving efficiency, for improving customer service and quality and prices and so on. But also we have to question what we're producing. If we're producing more toys to destroy the environment, to feed into consumerism, then we're still trapped into that vicious cycle of growth for the sake of growth.
Yes,
we have to be much more strategic in designing this and saying, what are the things that really are needed in the region to improve quality of life, to improve efficiency, to improve technology, to improve skill sets. And those are the industries that need to be pushed into that competition and forced to produce better results for the region. And if we're doing this as a strategy, it has to be in a way that's not the old-fashioned kind of protect the industries from foreign competition and then allow a handful of business people to become monopolies in the region. That's the wrong way to protect those industries. It has to be done with a set of rules that enforce competition and demand improvements in performance and productivity and quality of products and prices. Think of it as a utility, or as a regulated utility.
Yes.
To produce these things. And then finally, one thing that I didn't mention, maybe I should have spent a little bit of time mentioning, is if you move to a level of renewable energy production. So this can be done by states, regulating utilities, but there's also the idea of cooperatives, local solar and wind cooperatives producing their own energy for a local microgrid, right? So kind of off the grid for just a particular town or neighborhood. A lot of people ask me, can you finance a job guarantee at the local level? Can you finance a job guarantee in a developing country in just one village as a pilot project? And quite a few of us have been brainstorming ideas. So this is my way of kind of drawing from a couple of colleagues and putting our heads together and trying to figure out how can we leverage renewable energy production in a cooperative way on a village level, let's say, or a small town level, to create a local sovereign currency. So think of, once you have the solar infrastructure in place, it's producing wealth out of thin air, right? Literally, yes. just like the government creates a sovereign currency out of thin air, just by virtue of being the sovereign. So think of, I'm thinking out loud here, think of the solar cooperative that's already in place. It's producing wealth out of thin air. So think of that unit now issuing a local currency that's backed by the cooperative itself. Yeah. Right? So now the members of the community who are buying energy, buying electricity from the cooperative, they have a responsibility essentially of paying their bills to the cooperative, and they can pay their bills in that local currency. So now the cooperative is producing wealth out of thin air, out of sunshine essentially, and issuing a currency to finance jobs, community development, local jobs, and then requiring in payment of fees to itself that same local currency, right? Because the cooperative, as far as they're concerned, once the initial cost is covered, once the cost of maintenance is covered, everything else is free.
It's gravy.
Exactly. So instead of leaving everything else free, typically, solar farm units will charge you a fee anyway, right, for using electricity. In this case, the fee will be denominated in this local community currency. So you can issue as much of it as needed to finance community development jobs, and you can require payments of your utility bills to the utility cooperative in that same currency. So this sort of resolves the classic dilemma that the MMT community has about a sovereign currency requiring a tax payment So it can only be done by the federal government, or can only be done by, say, at the state level. If you're in the United States, if the governor's office decides, we'll accept these in payments of taxes. But on a micro scale in a small town, it's been very difficult to establish that. So this is one way we can think of, larger cooperative units that produce an essential commodity for the community that can require the community to pay the bill in that community currency. So just brainstorming some possibilities. And I'd like to invite everybody's feedback.
Is there any reason why we couldn't do things like that here in the United States?
No, absolutely no reason. Any local energy cooperative can be used in this way, right? Especially the ones that are regulated by the state.
So the future may be local energy cooperatives.
Why not? Yeah, and please share your feedback and comments. It will take me a few days, but I'll go back and answer as many questions as I can. Okay,
should we have a Q&A session right now?
I'm available, so if you'd like to do that, sure.
Okay. Okay, let's see what questions are on board right now. Can you see them in front of you?
I can't. So maybe if you read the questions.
Okay. Okay, I'm getting a lot of comments here. I don't see questions, but maybe.
Yeah, if it's going to take a while because some of the questions may be buried from the discussion before. I can go back and answer those questions on the Facebook feed, unless there are burning questions that are coming through the feed right now.
Okay, let's give them a few seconds here to start to manufacture some questions. Mm-hmm. And what I'm laughing at is some comments about my rubbing two sticks to get the power on again. But that wasn't the problem. It wasn't a power interruption. It was a camera introduction. I haven't yet traced what caused that. What I had to do was to end it, was to refresh the page, which I finally did at the last minute. But I was afraid to refresh the page while you were talking.
Well, you're going to have to go back and watch the show again. See what you missed.
I will definitely watch the show again. In fact, I usually watch these again. I spend a lot of time in watching shows again, both to learn how to be better, at my job, but also I want to clarify some points.
Sure. Yeah.
I found.
So how about we do this? Because some people are saying there were questions that were buried before, and some people are asking to recap because we did the recap already. So how about we invite everybody to type in their questions. And I'll go back. I promise to go back in the next couple of days and respond to all the questions and tag people so that they can see the answers when they come up. And if there's a need for another session or another follow-up Q&A, I'll be happy to do that at some point.
Okay, and so will I. So we certainly will be able to do this again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we are going to wind up for now. And there's one question here, which is from Rob Rivera. And Rob asks, Fidel, can you reach out to Richard Wolff? His lack of understanding of state currency is not up to par, and worker cooperatives are not the end-all and the be-all. I can see that that's somewhat relevant to what we're talking about here, but on the other hand, he knows a lot about how cooperatives operate.
Yeah.
It seems to me he might be a very good person to talk to.
I think it's a good. He'll be a good person to connect to, because what I'm introducing here to the idea of cooperative is the concept of financial sovereignty and using the currency as an engine for community development and economic development. I think that's what the traditional cooperative community and the Rick Wolff community doesn't necessarily have as part of their platform. So there's room for collaboration.
That they would really love that.
Absolutely.
The idea that there could be local sovereignties.
Right.
That
and not just the cooperative groups, but the local currency groups. I myself have spent a lot of time trying to figure out a way to turn a lot of those local community currencies into sovereign currencies, and I didn't come up with anything, because essentially a lot of the community currencies are just designed to stop the leaky bucket model, where a local community is producing a certain amount of wealth, it's generating jobs, and then people take the money from Ithaca, New York, and spend it in New York City. So that's the money is leaking out of the community. So one way to keep the money in the community and the spending in the community is to create this local currency that gives you a little bit of discount to spend within the community, to keep the money circulating inside the bucket as opposed to leaking out of the bucket. But it doesn't give you any room for sovereignty, for using it for really driving community development, other than keeping money in the community and not leaking out. But what we're thinking here is creating new wealth and creating a new currency that has that essentially taxing authority that allows it to issue currency to spend on certain, socially and economically beneficial kinds of economic activity, and then be able to accept that in payment of taxes or in payment of fees to the larger cooperative. In this case, it will be solar or wind. And that could include other community businesses that are kind of plugged into that collective economic unit. So it doesn't have to be just the solar cooperative. And this can be done for solar cooperatives that have already covered their cost of infrastructure and cost of maintenance. As I said, everything else they produce in terms of economic wealth is really out of thin air, out of sunshine.
Yeah, it sounds like in some ways that it's similar to a Mondragon model.
Mm-hmm.
You end up with the cooperative having its own bank, which is issuing the local currency based on solar energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of room to take our expertise from the MMT community and plug it into some of those initiatives and build upon those initiatives in a way that allows us to boost the potential for what we've been doing.
You're right, and the fascinating thing is that it's not simply macroeconomics anymore.
Right.
That's going into microeconomics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Much more, and that's also very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Fidel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful evening. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but I think you were able to go right through them, so that was wonderful.
Okay, great.
Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you, appreciate it. Have a good evening.
You too.